Well, good morning to everybody who's joined this morning's EMIC Academy. So welcome. Hope everybody is in good spirits and in good health and ready to embark on this trilogy of presentations by our valued partners, Travellers. For those who don't know me, my name is Patrick Smith. I'm the principal of the EMIC Academy. So for all intents and purposes, I'm your host today. We're going to run for the hour, and the format is going to be, once we get into the formal presentation, our presenter, who I will introduce in just a moment, will kick on. Questions can be asked on the control panel that you should see on your screens. If you can't see the control panel but can see an orange arrow or a white arrow with an orange back, click that because that hides or reveals, and you will see the questions drop down. So feel free, and I would urge you to ask questions on the platform whenever they occur to you. And once the formal presentation is complete, I will pose the questions that you've asked to our presenter, and hopefully we'll get anything emerging dealt with. So the trilogy, which is umbrellaed fittingly, given that it's Travellers, it spans risk best practice, moving from good to better. And this morning, in the first session, we'll be looking at cyber and social engineering, and we'll flow through best practice risk management in that area. There are two subsequent sessions under this risk best practice umbrella that you should have a look. They'll be posted. They are posted, I'm sure, on the EMIC website, but they'll be coming up on risk profiling and getting the balance right between the 24/7 culture of customer service versus taking care of our staff. So three really interesting topics. This webinar will be recorded, and the recording will be posted on the EMIC website, and the slides will be shared. So you'll have all of the collateral arising out of today's session. I've mentioned the questions. We'll see our presenter's face throughout, and you'll see at the top of each slide there are three small horizontal lines, which is the slider. So if any of the slides you're finding it difficult to read the content, you can use the slider to expand the slides on your machine. So the logistics are covered. So let me introduce you to today's presenter. So Davis Kessler, and Davis, following 5 years in private legal practice, then decided to join Travellers, and he joined their product development team in the US in 2012. And very quickly, Davis began focusing on cyber coverage issues. In 2018, he transitioned to Travellers Europe to develop the company's standalone cyber proposition. So he's become the center of excellence in the Travellers world, and he's led the cyber underwriting team since its launch in May 2018. So we've got an absolute expert on the topic. Without further ado, Davis, let me hand over to you.
All right, thank you, Patrick, for the introduction, and thanks to everyone for jumping on the call and sitting through this, and hopefully we'll cover off some good stuff and get some good questions later on. Yeah, obligatory disclaimer here, none of the slides we're going to talk about will talk about our coverage or anything of that nature. Really what we're going to talk about, as the title of the series suggests, is risk best practice. What does it look like to get from good to better? Before getting into that, I think we really need to know what are some of the trends that we are protecting against. So I'm really going to split this session into two halves. The first half being what are we seeing, what trends have developed, what do we see on the horizon in the cyberspace, and then how do we move from good to better? How can we protect ourselves against the worst of those things that we're seeing? So starting with what is out there, what are the cyber exposures that we are seeing as that, you know, I'm certainly plugged into the cyber press, but what are we in particular seeing in the cyber insurance world? So I'll start with some of the things that we definitely saw trend in 2019, and really, as many of you are aware, the cyber world is quickly evolving. Criminals have changed their approach in targeting um, really rapidly over the past 5, 6, 7 years. But we have started to see a few trends, worrisome trends, unfortunately, start to cement themselves as kind of what I'll call attritional losses in the cyberspace. Ransomware is certainly one of those, and probably the most concerning in terms of the efficiency and the level of demands that the criminals are making. Talk about that a bit more in detail in a bit. Um, the Also, as Patrick suggested, we're going to talk quite a bit about social engineering fraud. I would say those are the two biggest trends that are driving cyber losses in terms of insurance amounts paid. The other main trend isn't anything new, and that's data breaches. So I feel like we've kind of become a bit numbed to data breaches because they happen so much. But the fact is, when they do happen, it is still a very important and costly event, and it does impact people. And the fact is, data breaches aren't going away. In fact, all three of the big trends that I just mentioned are only increasing. We do live in a GDPR world, as you know. Again, something that was huge in the news a few years ago and probably has died down. Obviously, most recently with news being all about coronavirus and the pandemic and the effect of that on the economy, which I'll touch on in a bit as well. But the effects of GDPR are still very much with us, and we're still kind of feeling out how that will impact the cyber world and the cyber insurance world. I've got a graph here of the number of data breach reports made to the Information Commissioner's Office here in the UK, and you can see just a tremendous spike after GDPR went up fivefold. They should be soon releasing their data for the 2019 April through 2020 April. So it'll be really interesting to see what that trend looks like. I have to imagine it's not quite gone up fourfold again, but I would fully suspect that it has gone up. So really the three main trends that we're seeing are, again, ransomware, social engineering fraud, and data breaches. Just one thing I'm gonna touch on quite a bit throughout this in terms of data points is a survey that the Department for Digital Media, Culture, and Sport does annually. They do a cyber breach survey. It's a very robust survey. I believe there's something about 1,400 firms that respond to it. So it gives a really broad snapshot of what firms are seeing in terms of cyber incidents. But more importantly, what I find very useful from this study is cyber preparation and what firms are doing to better protect themselves, or in some cases, unfortunately, the lack of that protection. Here we're just showing firms that have identified being attacked within the last 12 months, and you can see it's well over half for anyone above the micro-sized firms. And even those micro-sized firms, I mean, you can imagine these are small shops, small farms, very small operations, maybe some little professional firms. Even those firms are reporting a near 50% attack rate over the last 12 months. So don't need me here to tell you cyber exposures are here. They're with us. They're part of our everyday lives. So again, let's know what they are and how do we protect against them. Click on to the next slide. So some of the things that we are seeing in development now, like I said, it's kind of more of the same. Unfortunately, I'm going to focus repeatedly on ransomware, social engineering, fraud, and data breaches, but ransomware it's only getting worse. The amount of ransom demanded in response to an infection is going up quite rapidly. And one thing that we're seeing for the bad guys, the criminals, do quite often is what's commonly known as doxing. This is where a criminal will not only get in and we can go back to the last slide. Sorry, get in and infect a computer system with a malicious ransomware virus and locking it down and demanding a ransom, something we all know about and see in the news. But what they're also doing now is exfiltrating data beforehand and holding that data ransom and threatening to disclose that sensitive information if they don't get paid. And this is kind of further leveraging their position, holding that extra little bit against these firms to get them to make that payment. So, now even if you have viable backups or you're able to get around the virus itself, you may still have to consider making that payment or the information will be released. One thing that this shows is just how rapidly the criminals have evolved in the cyberspace. 5 months ago, at the end of last year, very few criminal gangs were using the doxing method, and now I would say almost, well, I won't say every case, but quite a few cases that we see come in have this element attached to it. So really, it's a troubling development. These criminals are smart, unfortunately, but it's definitely something that we need to be mindful of. Social engineering fraud, there'll be more info on this on a couple slides later, but yeah, it's also increasing. It's become a war of attrition. We talk about phishing and training employees to avoid it, but they're good at it. The criminals are good at it, so that has been increasing as well. Some things that I wouldn't say are necessarily day-to-day trends, but certainly on the rise are nation-state attacks and industrial espionage. I saw a study saying that 2019 had a 42% increase in the number of cyber attacks attributed to foreign governments. Just by way of example, a couple days ago, Israel has accused Iran of hacking into one of their water supply facilities, and you can imagine in a country in the Middle East or in many places in the world, or even here, the damage that could be done if a foreign government or a organization tied to that foreign government gets into a critical utility or energy, water, whatever it may be. So that's definitely something that is going on and is only increasing. Same thing with industrial espionage. Nations are trying to get a leg up, and manufacturing is one thing that's always at risk here. Last year there were a number of attacks against automotive companies to basically learn their secrets. This week, the U.S. government has accused China of trying to hack into their coronavirus vaccine research. So, I'm not here to list all of them or make these attributions myself. These are attributions made by U.S. or Israel, as I've mentioned. But I think it's pretty obvious that this is happening and is only increasing over time. And supply chain concerns, I think again the pandemic that we're in has shown us how critical we rely on foreign trade and how the pieces all fit together in the manufacturing process and shipping, distribution, logistics, et cetera. And you know, this current situation we're in with coronavirus is, of course, a natural virus, but could just as well be a computer virus that has shut down critical pieces of that infrastructure, thus having knock-on effects to other firms down the line. We can go on. All right. Looking a bit closer at ransomware, this chart shows just how drastically the average ransom demands have gone up in the last only 15 months, 5 quarters. You know, if you think back to 2016, 2017, ransomware was it was there. Obviously, WannaCry was a very big deal, but we were talking a few £100 in terms of the demands made, and you know how effective that ransomware was often questionable. Obviously, WannaCry was quite effective, but a lot of times there were ways to get around these ransomware files, malicious files on the computers. That is unfortunately becoming a thing of the past. The ability of these criminals or organizations to infiltrate a computer network and then spread horizontally throughout that network, even getting into backups if backups are not appropriately set up. It's really driving, you know, it's increasing the efficacy of these criminals and making their demands more credible. And as a result, you can see the demands are skyrocketing. So again, we went from a few £100, few $100 per demand just a couple years ago, up to 5 figures 5 quarters ago, and now we're already up to 6 figures, and that trend doesn't seem to be slowing down anytime soon. And then talking about social engineering fraud, again, this largely generates from an email compromise. So a criminal will put together an email that looks you know, enticing a employee or a regular individual to click on that link. You know, again, coronavirus has been widely used as clickbait by these criminals lately. Something about 25% I've seen of all coronavirus related websites are in fact fraudulent, which is really quite astounding, that you know these criminals will play on people's fears to get them to click on a link or give up their login credentials for their email. And once these criminals are in, they are using that access to email to look for invoices or you know any sort of easily attackable funds transfer that they can make. So invoices or you know agreements in place where they can then pose as one of the parties and get the other party to make a fraudulent payment to their own bank account. One of the things that I call an unfortunate side effect really of this is the data breach element. So you know we know that these bad guys are in there looking for that quick win, looking for that financial benefit with the funds transfer fraud. But one thing that gets lost in the mix is when they do this, when they access your email account, there has been a breach of confidential information, and that is a important you know thing under GDPR, and in many cases it will be a reportable or one that requires notice to the ICO or maybe even potentially to the individuals. These criminals, well, while I don't want to write off criminals looking to obtain personal information, there is still a black market for certain personal information, health information in particular. Obviously, financial information can be used by criminals, but I would say a vast majority of the cases we've seen, they're not looking for that kind of follow-on sell or use of that information. They want that quick financial gain, but firms still have to respond as if that information was accessed because it was. And so what may have been a immediate loss of a few £1,000s, £25,000, maybe even more. We've seen social engineering fraud related funds transfers in the millions. Um, it it then gets the double impact of now you have a data breach and you're going to need to bring in a forensics firm to determine what servers had that criminal got access to. You need to bring in a law firm to determine what is your legal obligation in the aftermath of this event. Do you need to provide notification? And if you do, you then have those notification costs and potentially third-party claims as well. So it really is a two-pronged, or the impacts are two-pronged here when these criminals are looking for that social engineering fraud event. I mentioned that this is typically, I'd say almost exclusively, a result of email compromise. And going back to the data that the UK government put together in that cyber survey, 87% of all cybercrimes reported involved fraudulent emails. So you can just see how prevalent the social engineering fraud threat is. It's a quick, easy win. We are all human. We reuse our passwords. We click on links that look interesting, or look like we might have something to gain from it. The criminals are really good at getting us to fall for their schemes. One of the things that we definitely saw rise in the past year is a concern with managed service providers. So I'm not suggesting managed service providers are not a viable option. We just have seen a number of incidents involving them. So managed service provider is essentially a third party that will manage or maybe entirely or maybe partially your own computer network or even your network security. So that would be a MSSP, a managed security service provider. Again, touching on the UK survey, you can see quite a number of firms use managed service providers for at least part of their own network or security. It's 40% overall. With medium firms, it's up to 2/3. It's roughly half if you exclude the small micro firms. So 1 out of every 2 firms essentially uses a managed service provider. And the criminals again got wise to this and said, well, why do I want to go attack these individual firms one by one when I can just infiltrate the MSP and have backdoor access to 20, 50, 100 firms automatically? And that is what they started doing last year. And we've seen a number of incidents where the managed service provider is the firm that is infiltrated. The criminal then takes advantage of the MSP's own access to their clients' networks, and they're able to infect multiple firms all at once. We've seen the ransom demands coming from this to be quite large, so the criminals will make a ransom demand to each individual customer that has been impacted, but then they'll also make a much larger demand of the MSP itself. So this is, again, we're going to talk about, how do we protect ourselves against this? But this is definitely a trend that we have seen growing. Another concern when we're talking about third-party service providers is the potential for a data breach as a result of that. And we've actually seen a few incidents in the cyber news recently where firms that store data on behalf of other clients have been hit or had a data breach or a potential data breach, impacting dozens, even hundreds of their clients all at once. Interesting, over half of firms have reported having a data breach caused by one of the vendors. That seems dramatic, and this doesn't have to be a news breaking breach, of course, but the amount of breaches that occur is quite staggering, and the amount of firms that use third-party cloud service as storage is meaningful. I'm not suggesting, again, that this is a bad practice. There is a right way to do it. And in fact, when we talk later, I'm going to mention cloud backups as one of the right things to do. But I think you need to be aware of, what information you have stored, where it's stored, and you really need to do your due diligence on what company you're working with. So, this Ponemon Institute survey that's quoted here, only about a third of companies actually kept an inventory of the data that they were storing with these third parties. So, if you don't know what information you have stored or you've entrusted these third parties with, it could be a bad day if there's a breach, because not only is there a breach, but you're going to have to go through the effort of figuring out what it is that was potentially breached. Just a quick note on regulatory updates. I'm not going to go through all of these. Just want to be mindful that the issuance of privacy regulations is still going on. Again, everything seems to have taken a bit of a backseat to the coronavirus pandemic, but be rest assured that these legislations are still moving forward. Again, I mentioned GDPR. We saw a number of fines in 2019. I think the current pandemic may slow 2020 a bit, but fines still are being issued throughout the EU. It'll be interesting to see what 2020's total comes out to be, but this is very much this is a real concern, and well, I say concern. I mean, I think the GDPR is it's there for the right reasons. It's there to protect information, but it's definitely something that firms need to be prepared for and ready to deal with the consequences if they don't adhere to GDPR. We've seen with the UK, with Ireland, massive staff increases at the applicable data protection authority. So they're going to have the manpower to be able to prosecute these violations as they come in. There has been some legislation or some discussion about legislation forbidding ransom payment kicked around. There was some in the United States. Again, that kind of took a back seat to the current situation. But I wouldn't be surprised if there was some legislation down the road that does limit the ability to make a ransom payment. It may be limited to governmental agencies, but that would be a pretty dramatic impact to the cyberspace and insurance, of course. So more to follow on that. And just a couple mentions on legal development. So most people are probably familiar with the Morrison's case. It was widely seen as a quote-unquote cyber case. It was really a case about vicarious liability. I don't have the time to go through the whole thing, but the Supreme Court recently just cited on behalf of Morrison's, which many saw as a win for employers. This, of course, was a situation where a disgruntled employee had disclosed information about other employees. I think one of the takeaways is there's still very much value for a cyber security regime, and I'll make a plug for cyber insurance here as well. Had Morrison's put certain controls in place, maybe this wouldn't have happened. I'm not here to pass judgment on that, but what I do want to focus on is a cyber insurance policy and what it could have done in that situation. Even though Morrison's wasn't ultimately liable, it had defense costs that a cyber policy would have paid. Any forensics costs, any legal costs to determine, what their obligations were, that certainly would have been picked up by a cyber insurance policy as well. Public relations, that would have been at play here most likely. So, I think that yes, it's a win for employers on the vicarious liability front, but I hope it doesn't have any knock-on negative effect or negative impression for people's need to protect themselves with cyber insurance. The other big case to look forward to a decision later on this year, possibly early next year, is Lloyd v. Google. That will have a tremendous impact on the ability to form a kind of US style class action here in the UK court system. So definitely keep an eye on that case. Moving along here, another thing just real quick to keep an eye on. Windows 7 is of course no longer supported as of earlier this year. We know in the past that operating systems that do not receive regular support are potentially at risk of a type of malware being created to take advantage of that fact. I'm kind of surprised. I mean, this is a website that tracks the amount of percentage of different operating systems in the world, and globally, there's still almost 1 out of every 5 computers are still using Windows 7. Here in the West, that's a bit better. UK, it's only about 10%, 13% in the US, but that's still a lot of computers that are using an operating system that isn't supported and is potentially vulnerable as a result. So definitely be mindful of that. There's reasons at times why older operating systems are still necessary, but it's definitely something that you need to be mindful of. All right, so moving to the second phase. So how do we get from good to better? So here I'm gonna really focus on what we in the Traveler Cyber underwriting team look for. I'm not an IT security professional, so I'm not giving advice, from the IT point of view per se. But I think it's meaningful to know what we look for when we're looking at a submission. So one of the things that I think kind of overarches, individual controls, what is your, specific antivirus, yada yada. What is your management involvement? What is the culture? What is the cyber culture of the place? So one things we're looking for is an awareness and appreciation that says for the board. Of course, we want to appreciate the board. Sorry about that. It should be awareness, appreciation by the board of cyber situations. So it really, if the proper culture goes all the way to the top, it's probably going to be a much better protected firm than one that doesn't get a lot of attention at the top level. Similarly, one thing that we've definitely noticed is the level of involvement of senior management in incident response planning. In a perfect world, we're going to fend off all attacks, but we don't live in a perfect world. Even a firm that takes all the right steps, has the right culture, has the right, security protocols in place, breaches can still happen. How you respond to that is just as important as preventing it in the first place in many cases. And if senior management is involved in that planning stage, we see better results at the end of the day. And the other thing that we see or that we look for in terms of what does good look like is assessments, cyber risk assessments, pen testing, vulnerability assessments, and here ideally a third party conducting that so it's impartial, et cetera, able to give suggestions on corrections or approaches that can improvements that can be made. Here, looking at the UK government cyber survey results, kind of paints a dreary picture. So cyber updates to the board at least quarterly. Again, this is across all firms. All of these stats are going to be higher for medium and larger size firms. I know most of the audience here are would probably fall in the medium to larger firm size. So your numbers may be better, but this is the snapshot of the UK as a whole. About half of firms are giving regular updates at the board level. Only 16% have a formal incident management process. So, that's really concerning because, like I said, how you respond to a breach is oftentimes just as important as stopping that breach in the first place. About a third of firms have completed cyber risk assessments, but only about half of those are third parties. So again, I think these numbers are improving year on year. We are moving in the right direction, but there's a lot of ground to be made up and improvements that can be made. In terms of trying to prevent social engineering fraud, phishing, what we have seen be real effective is multi-factor authentication. And I actually, would you mind clicking the next slide? Next slide. Yeah, I apologize. This one should be the phishing, social engineering fraud, and the last slide should be ransomware. So we'll fix that up before we send that out. So sorry, can you go back to the previous slide? So this is the ransomware prevention. So here, multi-factor authentication for administrative access. So this is the ability to make changes to your corporation's computers, to run programs, to run executables, et cetera. Multi-factor authentication is generally one of the best protections you can put into place that is, I would say, easy and cheap, oftentimes free. So definitely multi-factor authentication for administrative access. One of the things that we definitely see tied to a higher chance of ransomware are open ports, in particular remote desktop protocol and SMP, which I'm blanking on at the moment what that stands for. But these two open ports are visible to the bad guys. When you have an open port to the internet, and some open ports are necessary. I mean, that's how we get our web browsers to get information, etc. That's how we send emails, for example. But remote desktop protocol, in particular, is exploitable by criminals. So if this port is open, there better be a really good reason for it. It should be limited in time, etc. So closing any unnecessarily open ports is a really good quick win to prevent a ransomware attack. I mentioned incident response. So certainly if you have the right protections in place, that's great, but you can be breached anyway. So how well are you able to respond? How secure are your backups? Are those backups tested? We've seen too many incidents where there is a ransomware situation. Oh, perfect, look at that, real-time correction. Yeah, we've seen too many incidents where there is a ransomware event and we go to the backups to try to restore the system, and the backups themselves are either corrupted or themselves infected because they haven't been properly tested. So good secure backups and testing those backups. If ransom payment is necessary, I showed a slide earlier what those ransom demands are and the trend that we're seeing in terms of how quickly the demands are escalating. Getting a good forensic firm that knows how to negotiate with the bad guys is critical. A good forensic firm will have experience in negotiating with these criminals. They may actually have negotiated with this particular criminal organization itself. And as a result, they may know how to lower that demand quite significantly. We've seen demands of 6, 7 figures go down to, 5, 5, 6 figures. So it it can be really critical to engage with the right groups. Here, this is more encouraging in terms of trends in the UK. So incident response, 68%, data backup, 69%. So that's great. 7 out of 10 firms are doing the right thing. That, of course, means 3 out of 10 are still leaving themselves exposed here to the ransomware situation. And when it comes to social engineering fraud, here again, multi-factor authentication is critical. I would say here, as opposed to administrative access, MFA for email is the real thing we look for to protect against this type of fraud. Again, we saw the stat where 87% of reported cyber fraud in the UK involved at some point an email infiltration. MFA is the easiest way to stop that. So if somebody does get you to fall for clickbait and get your login credentials, they will be stopped at the stage where they need to enter that authentication. It can be beaten, of course, but the thing is, criminals are looking for low-hanging fruit, and if your organization requires MFA and the one next to you does not, they'll just go attack, those next to you that don't have all the right precautions in place. And of course, staff training is definitely important in preventing phishing fraud. It's not perfect, but the right training, the right culture. Again, I talk about culture. Encouraging your employees to feel confident to stop, think before they click is the right way to prevent this type of fraud from happening. Here again, looking at the survey, only about a quarter of firms reported cyber training. That seems shockingly low to me. I hope it's not the case with the participants on this call, but I think it really shows that there's a lot of room for improvement here in terms of what can we do to stop this type of fraud. My final slide here is a shameless plug for cyber insurance, of course. We mentioned that even putting the right precautions in place doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be immune to a cyber attack. Good firms still get breached. And cyber insurance is a way to round out your protection against that loss or losses that can be attributed to that. I'm not here to plug Travelers by any means, or really any particular aspect of a cyber insurance policy in particular, but a cyber insurance policy is more than just the money that's going to be paid out in the event of a cyber incident. A good cyber insurance policy will also come with risk management tools. So maybe it'll come with employee training. Maybe they'll come with access to some of those third-party assessments and advice. And of course, on the back end, a good cyber insurance proposition is going to carry with it the vetted breach response network on the back end. So if you've had a breach, you'll be able to quickly get in touch with the right knowledgeable vendors to do your IT forensics, the right law firms that know how to handle these situations, and can take what is a bad situation and bring it back to normal as quickly as possible. Looking at the cyber insurance take-up in the UK, and it is quite low. So even amongst the large firms, it was only 21% across the UK as a whole, and for medium and small, it goes down from there. So I think we're still in early days here. That number will go up as firms see the value of cyber insurance. It's up to us as the industry to also explain what that value is. And I think if you look at on the left-hand side at some of the reasons given for not taking up insurance, lack of awareness of cyber insurance being 23%. That just goes to show that we as the insurance industry needs to up our game as well in terms of educating the public and firms as to what that value is. I put in a stat from the ABI, the Association of British Insurers. They released an article last August saying that of ABI members of 2018 cyber claims, 99% were paid. That has to be one of the highest payout rates of any type of insurance out there. And I think it's a shocking number that it kind of goes under the radar. You still see some press about cyber claims not being paid. Some of those have to do with the WannaCry. A lot of that, some of that is because they're not even talking about cyber insurance policies. It's just a cyber event that's potentially covered under a property policy or some other type of policy. So in actuality, almost all cyber claims are getting paid. It just to me goes to show that the value of a cyber insurance policy. So I have talked very fast for the allotted 45 plus a couple minutes. Now it's time for questions. So, when we initially put this together, sorry, Patrick, I was just going to say, we wanted it to be very, informal and have a conversation face to face. Unfortunately, we are, not face to face. You can see my face, but by all means, ask any questions that you have.
Great stuff. Thanks very much indeed, Davis, and fascinating. I think for all risk professionals and practitioners, the sort of breadth and depth of the stats and data you've provided, is really excellent and invaluable. Couple of questions emerging, so we'll start from the top. Being very mindful of the management awareness stats that you showed us, and accepting there's some way to go, do you have any tips in engaging the business? So what I mean here, any tips for risk managers as they try and engage the business in the whole area of cyber risk, and particularly mindful of where management awareness currently stands generally, very conscious that in terms of likelihood and impact, cyber-related risks figure highly in the World Economic Forum top 10 risks. And of course, the sort of challenge of engaging with IT specialist colleagues within our businesses. I just wonder whether you, mindful of all of that, have any kind of tips that you've seen work well for risk managers?
Yeah, I think that last point you made is one area that I would focus on. When giving a report to the board, I would recommend not making it too IT heavy, I'll say, in terms of jargon. Like I said, I'm myself not an IT professional. The board members have to deal with quite a lot of matters, wide range. So distilling down that IT information into, I'll call it layman's terms, is I think critical at getting their attention. Yeah, you can have it as a line item on your report and check the box as yes, we informed the board, but if they don't really engage with it, it's losing its value. So putting that into terms that are more easily understood, I think, is a good first step.
Yeah, and I'd just sort of add to that comment, really based on my own experience, is that if you go down the sort of IT technical dialogue and language, you can actually lose senior management attention, because you need to use aligned language to the exec and the board and how they look at the health of the organization and the strategies they have in place. So thanks very much for that. Let me ask another question that's cropped up, and I'd urge any of the audience, if you've got a burning question, do place it onto the control panel so that I can pose it to Davis. Do you have any quick steps that you think risk managers could take to better understand their company's cyber vulnerability in terms of impacts, particularly financially? I mean, I'm just sensing that unless risk can be really solidly quantified, that might be one of the barriers to buying insurance. And as you say, the take-up of insurance is almost surprisingly low. The prominence of the cyber risk is high. Maybe the bit in the middle is the ability to actually quantify that risk so that you can transfer it. Just wonder whether there are any quick steps or suggestions you might have for RMs to better understand the risks.
Yeah, I think I would answer that by saying there's definitely a sliding scale in terms of size and complexity and financial strength of different firms. So what may be the right answer for a small firm may not be the right answer for a corporate firm that has hundreds, if not thousands, of servers. On the lower end, so for a smaller firm, one thing I would recommend is being aware of, for what the UK government publishes. The NCSC and the Department of Digital Media and Culture, they actually put out quite a lot of materials on quick how-to guides, checklists of things you should be paying attention to, etc. Cyber Essentials is it's a small investment. I mean, we're talking a few £100, literally, but it will, and it's designed to call out those quick wins, password management, multi-factor authentication, things like that. So there's definitely a lot of government resources that are out there and are, I think, easy to say, underutilized. One thing I didn't mention, well, I take that back. I did mention it. The coronavirus pandemic and what that's doing to the cyber world. I brought that up a few times, but I didn't really get into its impact because I think we're still, as an industry, feeling that out. But on that topic, on the topic of working from home, for example, these government websites that I've mentioned, they will have guidance on setting up working from home environments for those smaller firms. Medium and large firms can probably take something away from those resources as well, but I think a larger firm that has more resources, more complexity, a larger network footprint, should really look into getting a third-party assessment, getting a penetration test, getting a vulnerability test. Those may not be as quick wins as you specifically asked for, but they're going to be critical in pointing out any flaws or any holes that could be exploited and recommending how to prevent that from being exploited.
Great, thanks very much. And I'm very conscious always that the lessons available to small, medium and large firms generically are likely to be the same. And whilst larger firms might have a wider span of resource, it's more likely to be siloed, of course. So, you know, again, that's something to be navigated by the best-in-class risk manager. One other question, you know, we read a lot in the media about 5G and the battle for 5G sort of supremacy, if you like. How do you think this might impact, if it will at all, cyber risk and, you know, potentially this kind of hunger quest for data, probably underpins the 5G strategies, but also whether this might promote more, nation state attacks. Just one of your thoughts on what 5G emergence might do to this whole area.
Yeah, well, here I have to totally make disclaimer that I'm not an expert in this area. I can only relay what I've read in the cyber press. What I do understand is 5G is going to significantly change the overall internet footprint, the speed at which the internet will operate, and as a result, the amount of information that will flow. You know, it's going to, if you believe what you read, it's going to revolutionize the internet again. And as we've seen more and more data, more and more complexity out there, that is a larger footprint for the criminals to take advantage of. So insofar as it's going to increase the overall amount of stuff that could be exploited, I would not find it hard to predict that the level of exploitation will rise accordingly. But again, I apologize, I'm not really an expert on 5G.
No, don't worry. We value your opinion, but note that it's an opinion. So, in the interest of time, maybe we just wrap up there. I think there are a few takeaways for us, and what was really an action-packed presentation with lots of information for us. The thing I would say, if you have any after the event questions, you'll see on your screen now the email address of Travellers. Feel free to pose them if anything occurs to you. I think it was really interesting to see the stats breakdown on the management awareness, because of course the reason why EMIC members are dialing into this is that we want to be better at managing cyber risk, and our quest individually and collectively will be to get our businesses into the fully engaged category rather than yet to be engaged category. I think it's really interesting to learn about your background, Davis, and you've made the point 3 or 4 times that you're not an IT professional, and I think that gives a real suggestion or inspiration to risk managers, because if we accept that technology is here to stay, technology will increasingly underpin businesses, our firms, then that means cyber risk is here to stay. And actually, I think you're a good example of what risk managers can do, and you don't have to be an IT professional to really decide to become a cyber risk expert. And I think unlocking the resources that are available, not just through EMIC, but also things like all of the government resources, cyber essentials, it would be really good for that to be absolutely in the DNA of best practice risk managers going ahead. So I thought that was insightful. I think the other point that I would just draw out is that your point around the use of managed service providers, and I suppose one of the issues for risk managers may arise out of really knowing where your data is and where it goes. And actually, it's not just you as a firm having a breach, but if you're relying on others supplying services, you need to understand their vulnerability and maybe look at what contracts do you have in place? Where's your remedy if some of your data in their hands is breached? And ultimately, I guess that if you can't clearly articulate where your data is, that does sort of increase your risk of a GDPR fine, because you would have thought a basic standpoint of any the quality of a risk management system is in this respect knowing where your data is. So I think there were some really interesting pull away points. With that, we've now hit our deadline. I want to say a final thank you to Davis and to Travellers. Great session, good questions, very engaging. So with that, we'll close the virtual door, say thank you very much, and look forward to part 2 of the best practice risk management trilogy. So have a good day, everybody, and thank you for joining. Thank you.
Thank you all.